news you can use.
Welcome to another edition of The Scoop, where we're providing news you can use. I'm Louise Thompson, the Executive Director of Tampa Bay Community Network. You can find us at www.tvcn.org. With me today is C.J. Roberts. He's the President and CEO of the Tampa History Center, Tampa Bay History Center. Welcome.
Thank you.
Glad you could come and visit with us.
Good to be here.
I know the History Center itself has a big history. Why don't you give us some of that?
Sure. The History Center really dates itself back to the 1940s when the Florida legislature authorized county governments to create historical commissions where they could preserve stories and artifacts. Our county, Hillsborough, did that, created a small museum that was in the old courthouse that operated for years and years. Up until about the late 1980s, when Commissioner Jan Platt, among others, walked through one day and noticed that some of the things were kind of disappearing from that history museum, and maybe we weren't doing as good a job stewarding our material culture and the history of this area as well as we could. So the County Commission authorized the creation of a task force to study the situation and come back with some recommendations. And they chose the task force very, very well. They chose individuals who had a love for history, but were also very business savvy in their approach to things. And this group came back to the commission and they said, you know, the stories from this area are terrific. The artifacts are fabulous. We think we do in fact have all the things necessary to make a great history museum, but you, County Commission, should first ask us to do two things. One, to create a business plan that will stand up to scrutiny, and two, to raise an endowment, because we know public funding is not always going to be there. And so we want to make sure that not only can we open this thing, but we can keep it going long into the future. The county was very receptive to that idea and basically said, fine, good luck, and come back and let us know when you've gotten there. And in fact, this group pulled it off. They did create that business plan. It was a very conservative model. They did raise $11 million in endowment. The county then decided to commit $17 million in CIT funding. For about the last 20 years, this process has gone on leading up to our grand opening last January. So it is kind of an interesting history. As an aside, the first call that we have, the first time we see in this community really an appeal for a history-type museum, was something that was published in the Sunland Tribune back in 1882 by a fellow named Judge Joseph Knapp, who was saying, you know, we need to preserve the stories and the artifacts of this region before not another vestige of them survive. So 127 years later, we got it done.
Oh my God, did it take a while?
It did.
In the meantime, until you opened last year, you're open just a little over a year, correct?
No, we're open, we've been open 3 months. We opened in January of 2009.
January of 2009. Okay, that's right. Okay, so, and between the time you moved out of the courthouse and got this new building, where were you?
Yeah, we had a couple of different locations in town, but the one where we were the longest was in the Convention Center Annex. And we operated what we called a preview center, where we had some teaser exhibits, some artifacts from our collections on exhibit, as well as some information about the museum to come. We knew that was never going to be our permanent home. We always had our sights set on something bigger, but it took a little while to put it all together.
Now, you had some exhibits I do remember seeing in the over at the courthouse, but because you built this bigger how big is the building?
The building is 60,000 square feet,
big one.
4 stories tall. It's a nice size facility.
You added stuff. Where'd you get it?
We inherited that original historic collection from Hillsborough County, which was about 8,000 artifacts and some wonderful treasures within that collection. And then over the years, as we've reached out to the community, we have continued to grow our collections, and until today, they stand at about 40,000 artifacts.
And you were filled the 60,000 square foot facility? Or
we had. The facility has about 17,000 square feet of permanent exhibits. Okay. We also have, of course, a museum store. We have a restaurant. We've partnered with the Columbia Restaurant. They are our food service provider. They've built within our facility trying to replicate their 1905 era cafe. So we have the Columbia Cafe operating, which is
and they're serving their 1905 salad.
They are indeed.
Oh, it's just the best salad in town.
Just a terrific partner to have. We have a library. We have a map gallery. We have about 4,000 square feet of collection storage space where things that are on exhibit can be housed and where we can continue to collect and house materials as our collections grow. Our administrative offices are in that space. We have classrooms, meeting rooms, so there's a lot more to it than just simply than the galleries.
How is it divided up? How do you sectioned it off in some manner, right?
Well, we did. I mentioned four-story building, but the ground level is exclusively parking. We were very concerned because of our proximity to the water. We're right on Garrison Channel, right across from Harbor Island,
Right.
in a beautiful new city park called Cotonchobee, Fort Brooke Park. I say new because while there was a Fort Brooke Cotonchobee Park dating back a few years, they've just added significantly onto that. In fact, we'll be dedicating that in the next several weeks. The first floor, the first program level of the building is actually at 28 feet above sea level because we took into account an historic kind of storm situation, which heaven forbid never happens, but if it does, recognizing that we are stewards of some of the most historically important artifacts anywhere in the region, we wanted to make sure that those were safeguarded to the extent possible. On that level, then, is where visitors will purchase their tickets. There's a large glass open atrium that is filled with what we call icons, which are sort of artistic elements hanging from the ceiling that are framed in neon, and they're things that are evocative in one way or another of this area's history or culture. It's a flamenco dancer or a tarpon fisherman, Babe Ruth hitting the longest home run of his career here in Tampa, the Gasparilla ship, things to add really color and life to this entry space. The museum store, the cafe are also in that space, as is the first level of permanent exhibitions. This,
Terrific.
yeah, it's really, really laid out nicely.
Okay, and so, and then going up from there?
The second floor houses our library and research center, houses a map gallery. And by the way, we have a show on right now, and we happen to have, thanks to the generosity of Tom and Lee Touchton, over time, they will be gifting to us what is one of the finest collections of historic maps of this area, of the state of Florida, anywhere in private hands that we know of. It is a beautiful, beautiful collection.
That was their personal collection?
That was their personal collection.
That's wonderful.
And they've spent the last couple of, I guess about 20 years or so putting this collection together. The inaugural show is a history of a 400-year preview of Florida maps.
I want to hear more about this, but we're going to have to take a little break. We'll be back. Stay tuned. Welcome back to The Scoop. I'm Louise Thompson, Executive Director of Tampa Bay Community Network, and with me is C.J. Roberts, who runs the Tampa Bay History Center. Before we took the break, you started to talk about this 24-county representation. I guess I didn't know Hillsborough County actually took up 24 counties?
In the mid-19th century, Hillsborough County was much larger geographically than it is today. And over time, 24 present-day counties have been carved out of that original, what we call historic Hillsborough County. And it's from that larger area that we're drawing our stories, which really gives us a wonderful portfolio.
How far north did we go in
all
south
the
and
way up
east?
to Gainesville, all the way down
To Gainesville?
all the way down to close to
This
the
Lord
shores of Lake-
Hillsborough must
Lake
have been some
Okeechobee.
guy, huh?
Well, it was a much different place at that time.
Wow, all the way to Okeechobee.
Yeah.
Pretty far. And there are 24 counties in that space now that were just one. It's a phenomenal thing. Okay, so in addition now, you got these maps up here that explain a lot of this, the area that Hillsborough County had. What else is up there?
Well, and by the way, within that map collection is a wonderful jewel that people from here, I think, will particularly want to see. We have on exhibit a map showing for the first time the word Tampa printed on it, which is a 1621 map, which is that's a
How old
neat
is
piece
that?
to have. 1621, imagine that.
It was called Tampa back
Yeah,
then. Which Tampa meant? Remind me.
Well, there are all kinds of theories, whether it's
Right.
sort of sticks of fire, I think
Sticks
probably
of
the most
fire, I
common
remember
one,
that
the
one,
Native
yeah.
American term, but nobody's
That's not
nobody's
the
really
only
certain.
one, though, I
No, there
kind
are
of
others.
remember from when I was doing journalism here 20 or so years ago. There was another one that people gave it to. It's
And
interesting.
you see it.
You mentioned a word before when you talked about the name of the new park, the Fort Brooke area. That name wasn't there before, was
No,
it?
Cotonchobee. It's a Seminole term, Seminole word that
It
was.
doesn't mean casino.
It does not,
Okay.
but it was chosen by the tribe to name the park, Fort Brooke Cotonchobee Park, when it was set up several years ago. Cotonchobee is a Seminole word for where the big water meets the land, and how appropriate, particularly for us, because that's what our stories are all about. They're about this meeting of land and water, and then the historical events that came out of that sort of natural environment that was
I
here.
think it's pretty cool that you took advice and words from the Indians, which, you know, we've heard over so many years
They're
we've
an awfully
neglected.
big part of the story.
They're an awfully big part of this area now, too. Again, once again, I guess because of the economic impact they're making. But I think that really speaks volumes. Tell me about some of the other exhibits that you have. Are there some people-oriented ones, costumes, these kinds of things?
Well, we have tried to showcase wherever possible stories. This is not a museum. You can find dates and facts and all of that, but it's the stories that really stand out. We start by introducing people to the original inhabitants of this area, who were not, by the way, Seminoles. They were Timucuan and Tocobagan Indians, whose cultures date back perhaps 12,000 years. They were mound-building cultures who built ceremonial mounds in what is now downtown Tampa, most of which
boy, are
were,
we in trouble,
most
huh?
of which were leveled in the 19th century. But we have some wonderful archaeological evidence of their being here, and of course,
That was dug up from downtown? Oh, my goodness.
some were downtown, and then other digs throughout the region have unearthed these things that tell us a little bit about these cultures. We also know their descendants were the ones who came in contact with the early Spanish explorers, and that's a big story for us. In 1528, the Narvaez expedition under the command of Panfilo de Narvaez come to Tampa Bay, some 400 conquistadors strong. They are searching primarily for gold. They come inland. They meet up with the native inhabitants who are here. They tell them to head north looking for gold, which they do, and long story short, some 8 years later, there would be 4 survivors who would make it back to Spanish-occupied areas in Mexico.
Out of the
and tell their
400?
story out of the 400. The rest would die through conflict with the natives, or disease, or accidents. It's been described as a brutal journey, and the title of a book that was published a couple of years ago under that name, and I think it's very apropos. Powerful story, and what it marked was the first interior exploration of what would become the United States by Europeans, and it happened here. And it happened almost a century before Jamestown and Plymouth colonies, and it's
And
a
before
story
1592 and all that.
all of that. So it's
That is
it's a
interesting.
great story
Nobody
to tell.
was looking for the Fountain of Youth down here, though.
No.
Did Potts just show up around here, or he
A little farther south.
made it
Little
farther
farther
south? He did. So, okay, so there's a story that sounds really interesting. You're able to tell that story in the museum by way of video, by way of, how's it done? How are your exhibits?
Couple different ways. What we tried to avoid with these exhibits were what we call cabinets full of curiosities, cases just loaded down with stuff, and lots of verbiage or text panels on the walls. We didn't want to go there. Modern audiences don't respond well to that. So what we've tried to do is create exhibits that are either immersive, that sort of take you to a different time and place, that are interactive, that are story-based. In the case of the Narvaez story, we have produced a film called Winds of Change, which tells that story very, very well. It's a 14-minute piece, which is about the average attention span for audiences these days, for that kind of thing anyway. It really kind of gives you a sense that you're there. We also have several artifacts related to the story of Spanish exploration, so you can not only experience the story seeing the AV piece, but you can also see items just as those conquistadors would have used.
I was interested with, I just started thinking about what you said about the digs that were done in the area that showed, you know, this long existence of inhabitants in the area. What are the kinds of things that have been uncovered?
Pottery shards, points, sort of arrowheads, I think as most people would call them. Those kind of things for the most part.
And they've been all dated by some.
Yeah, they can date those things with reasonable accuracy. We also have on loan to us a 3,500-year-old dugout canoe that was excavated. Actually came out of a swamp in North Florida. something that's 1,000 years older than Christ, which is really kind of
That's
amazing.
mind-boggling
It is.
almost.
It is.
You can't imagine that that would be so.
Yeah.
You're not entering it in the boat show, though.
We will not. I don't think it would float. It's.
You don't think it'll float? Well, okay, so I'd really like to know what are some of the exhibits that most people stop and stare at and stay there for a long period of time. But I think before we get into that, I might be headed for a break. What are the hours before I go to that quickly?
We are open daily, 7 days a week, 10 to 5.
7 days? Okay. So I think people will be interested in being able to visit it at any given time. But I do want to hear more about these things. We'll be back. We're going to take a short break. We'll be back in just a moment. Stay tuned. Welcome back to The Scoop, providing you some news you can use. I'm Louise Thompson from Tampa Bay Community Network, and with me is C.J. Roberts from the Tampa Bay History Museum, which just reopened with a really big, new, beautiful building just in January of 2009, and we're all invited to come and see it. CJ, tell me about the exhibits that just attract the greatest number of people, and they can't walk by them for whatever reason. They're so interesting.
There are several. There's one that stands out that almost every visitor comments on their way out, and that is a piece that we use to tell the story of the Second Seminole War, and it's called Kawakachi's Story. I mentioned a Seminole War chief who was a contemporary of Osceola's. He was with Osceola when they were captured and imprisoned together in Fort Marion and St. Augustine. They broke out together. Ultimately, Kawakachi would be recaptured by federal authorities, brought back here to Fort Brooke, precursor to modern-day Tampa, and placed on a brig out in the bay where he finds himself bargaining for his life. Federal authorities here are telling him that he will recall his warriors from the field in X number of days or he'll be hanged. He is successful.
They put him on a barge in the water?
That was to sort of
like
keep him from
prison?
escaping and chained him up and the whole bit.
Okay.
He is successful in recalling at least enough of his warriors to satisfy the authorities here.
How does he get to call them when he
Sends out messengers into the forest, and they let him have runners going back and forth, and no email, no text messages.
I was going to say, how do you do smoke signals? What's happening?
He is successful. His reward is that he is taken out to Egmont Key, where he's reunited with his family, placed on another brig, ultimately sent to New Orleans to become part of the Trail of Tears and the relocation of all but 200-300 Seminoles from the state of Florida. Powerful, powerful story. And this story is documented by a young American junior officer who was stationed at Fort Brooke named John Sprague. And Sprague really had an unusual level of objectivity about him given his circumstances, the fact that he is an Army officer. He kept a journal, and he would publish that in the late 1840s telling this story. We have brought this story to life in a theater experience that is part diorama, part AV. Basically, visitors walk in and they'll see a scrim, a cotton scrim stretched between trees, and there's sort of foliage hanging above you, and sort of the sounds of if you're in a hammock or something like that. And as the story starts to unfold, this scrim upon which is painted a mural of Tampa Bay, when it is backlit, it becomes transparent in that place, and you see behind it various three-dimensional diorama sets that start to tell this story, and it's mixed in with audio-visual pieces. We went and we used reenactors, we used members of the Seminole tribe to film this and put it together, and when we saw it, our staff saw it for the first time, it's the kind of thing that just sort of gives you goosebumps. In this case, we were able to tell this story through the eyes of someone that saw it unfold.
Lucky we
so
had the ability to put it down on the journal.
Indeed. So I think it gives a certain balance, certainly a credibility to the piece, and it is by far the most talked about exhibit element. But other visitors will respond very positively to our Cigar City story, which is far more, as you know, than the manufacturing of little brown cigars.
We actually produce, one of our community members produces a cruise show here with Cigar City as his whole theme. But
yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, it's a great story. It's a story of food and art and music, immigration, mutual aid societies, a lot of layers to it. There are a lot of aha moments for our visitors as they go through that piece. It is another example of an exhibit where we've tried, much like we have with the Seminoles, we've tried to bring the story right up to the present. We've taken the approach in this museum that history didn't have to happen 12,000 years ago or 500 years ago. It happened yesterday. It happened this morning. So not only do we talk about the history of the cigar industry, but we talk about things like historic preservation efforts of cigar factories in Ybor and West Tampa today. We talk about how to make a Cuban sandwich today. Those kinds of things. We talk about what's happening within the Seminole tribe today. Yes, we talk about gaming. Yes, we talk about alligator wrestling. We talk about a lot of those stories that we know that are only part of the culture of the Seminole tribe. Other exhibits that we see visitors really responding to on the second floor, we talk about the cattle industry. The cattle industry, for all intents and purposes, started here in 1513 with Ponce de Leon, who introduced the first cattle from Spain. And it continues to flourish today. We kind of bounce back and forth. We're maybe the number 3, number 4 cattle producing state in the nation, which a lot of people don't realize. We have a neat video that we show where a working rancher, a multi-generation ranching family, takes you through a tour of his ranch, and it's set up. There are a lot of things that are of particular appeal to children. And in front of this large screen, we have saddles mounted on springs so kids can kind of ride along as Mr. Lightsy's taking you through on a tour of his ranch. We talk about the citrus industry. We talk about agriculture in general, the story of the ports. We brought in a shipping container, retrofitted it into a theater where we have kind of a wacky sort of fun approach to telling the story of the ports, the history of the ports, what's going on at the ports today. Sports, festivals, recreation, we talk about those as well, and some great artifacts there, whether it's Al Lopez's bat or Leroy Selman's jersey, Judy
You have
Alvarez's
collected
tennis
all that.
racket.
Have you
Sure,
collected
sure.
it all?
You need those
Oh,
pieces
wow.
to tell the stories. War Stories is our military exhibit from Fort Brooke, again, to which
Which
Tampa
didn't
can
look
trace
like
its
the
origins.
garage we all know,
It
correct?
did not look like a garage.
But
and it-
some people do think that. Okay.
I guess maybe they
yeah.
do. Maybe they do. But anyway, we take the story right up through what's going on at present-day MacDill. Lots of kind of personal stories. It is not our goal to try to tell the story of World War II necessarily, but it is our goal to talk about someone from here who served over there, or someone who was serving here on the home front, telling the kinds of stories that I think we can all relate to.
What about UT, right here where we are, the University of Tampa?
Yep.
And
That's
the
certainly part of that.
plant hotel.
We talk about that, but more importantly, we encourage visitors to come see the Tampa Bay Hotel, because that's
Okay.
the real deal. And we encourage visitors to go see Casitas in Ybor and to see the Ybor City State Museum.
Which is a great museum as
We're
well.
not trying to tell either of those stories, but rather complement what's already here and maybe kind of tie it all together.
Thank you so much for coming down and telling
Thank
us
you.
about it. Appreciate everybody tuning in. We'll see you next time. Thank you.
News you can use.